What if I told you that the most powerful weapon in the American Revolution wasn't a musket, but a manuscript? Before the first shots were ever fired at Lexington and Concord, before the ink had dried on the Declaration of Independence, something else was already burning. Quietly, steadily, and with far more reach than gunpowder ever could. It was an idea, or rather, a constellation of ideas, born not on the battlefield, but in the quiet chambers of philosophers, the cluttered desks of thinkers, and the flickering candlelight of Enlightenment salons. The American Revolution is often remembered through images of redcoats, colonial militias, and ringing church bells. But beneath the noise and chaos, there was something far subtler at work, a philosophical uprising. This was not just a war for territory or trade. It was a rebellion against the very way power had been understood for centuries. The colonists weren't just rejecting British rule, they were rewriting the meaning of authority itself. And the blueprints they followed didn't come from generals. They came from thinkers. John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau. These were the minds who dared to suggest that people had natural rights, that governments must serve the governed, and that liberty was not granted by kings, but born into the soul of every human being. So here's the question we begin with. What happens when philosophy moves from the salon to the battlefield? What happens when the abstract becomes the anthem of a nation in the making? To answer that, we must start at the root of it all, with a man who believed that rebellion wasn't a betrayal of order, but a return to justice. His name was John Locke. Long before the American colonists picked up their rifles, they picked up the writings of a quiet, determined English philosopher named John Locke. And in doing so, they found the words that would give moral fire to their cause. Locke wasn't a soldier, nor did he lead a political movement. But what he offered was something far more radical. A new understanding of human nature, of power, and of the sacred relationship between the individual and the state. At the heart of his philosophy was a simple yet profound claim that every human being is born with certain natural rights, not rights granted by rulers or empires, but rights that exist simply because we are alive. The right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property. But Locke didn't stop there. He believed that government exists not to control, but to protect these rights. And if a government violates this sacred duty, if it becomes a tool of oppression rather than a guardian of freedom, then the people have not just the option, but the right to rebel. Not in chaos, but in conscience. Not for power, but for justice. Now imagine what those ideas meant to the American colonists in the 1770s, living under a distant monarchy that taxed without consent, ruled without representation, and dismissed their appeals for fairness. Locke gave them language for their frustration and legitimacy for their defiance. Thomas Jefferson knew this. He didn't simply admire Locke, he echoed him. When Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, he reached directly into Locke's philosophy and breathed it into the soul of a new nation. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness wasn't just a poetic turn of phrase. It was Locke, reimagined for the American spirit. Pursuit of happiness became the American evolution of Locke's property, a recognition that freedom must expand beyond material ownership into the realm of human potential. In Locke's world, monarchy wasn't sacred. Divine right was a myth. And no title, no crown, was greater than the dignity of a human soul. That was revolutionary thinking in the 17th century. And by the 18th, it had become the heartbeat of a rebellion across the Atlantic. Locke, in many ways, lit the fuse. But it would take another mind to design the mechanism that would preserve freedom once won. To build a government strong enough to rule, yet restrained enough to serve. For that, the revolution turned its gaze to another philosopher, one who believed liberty could only survive through balance. That man was Montesquieu. If John Locke handed the revolutionaries the moral blueprint for liberty, it was Montesquieu who handed them the architectural plans. Because once you declare yourself free, once you tear down a monarchy, you're faced with an even greater question. What do you build in its place? Montesquieu, a French nobleman and political thinker, was born into the privileges of the aristocracy. But instead of clinging to power, he spent his life studying how it could be restrained. In his masterpiece, The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu made a bold claim, one that would ripple through the centuries. He argued that liberty was not a natural consequence of revolution. It had to be designed, protected, engineered through the careful distribution of power. At the core of his philosophy was the principle of separation of powers, that government must be divided into branches, each with distinct functions and the ability to check the others. Legislative, executive, judicial. One makes the laws, one enforces them, one interprets them, and none can dominate the others without resistance. To Montesquieu, unchecked power was the enemy of freedom. And tyranny didn't always announce itself with a crown. It could arrive wrapped in the language of patriotism or cloaked in democracy. So his solution was structural. Create a system where ambition contains ambition, where no single hand can hold all the reins. The American founders took this to heart. When they drafted the U.S. Constitution, they didn't just imagine freedom, they built it brick by philosophical brick into the bones of the Republic. The three-branch system wasn't a coincidence. It was Montesquieu brought to life. The checks and balances weren't just procedural, they were philosophical shields, forged to guard against the very abuses the colonies had just escaped. But here's what's fascinating. Montesquieu came from a world of inherited privilege, a European aristocrat envisioning restraint in a system he benefited from. And yet, his ideas found their fullest expression not in the halls of Versailles, but in the bold experiment of American republicanism. The colonists took his vision of divided power and made it their own, radical, rugged, and enduring. Still, as Locke taught the revolutionaries what they were fighting for, and Montesquieu taught them how to protect it, there was yet another voice rising in the Enlightenment. A voice not just concerned with systems or rights, but with something deeper, the spirit of the people, the soul of the citizen. That voice belonged to Rousseau. If Locke taught the revolutionaries that they had rights, and Montesquieu showed them how to safeguard those rights through institutions, Rousseau asked a more intimate, unsettling question. What kind of people must we become to truly be free? Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that liberty was not merely a matter of laws or structures. It was a state of being that emerged from our connection to one another. In his eyes, freedom was not the unrestrained will of the individual, but the collective agreement of a community working in harmony with its own highest good. This was the essence of his most powerful idea, the general will. The general will wasn't about majority rule. It wasn't mob mentality or public opinion. It was something deeper, the shared moral direction of a people who see themselves not just as individuals, but as participants in a collective life. For Rousseau, the legitimacy of any government came not from conquest or heritage, but from the popular sovereignty of the governed. A society is free, he argued, only when its laws reflect the collective will of its citizens, and when each person, in obeying those laws, is obeying a version of themselves. Now, Rousseau's ideas were radical, even in his time. He questioned inequality, challenged aristocracy, and insisted that true democracy could only be born from civic virtue, from citizens who cared more for the whole than for their private gain. And while the American revolutionaries were not as extreme in practice, they absorbed his spirit. You can feel Rousseau's pulse in the growing American emphasis on public service, on Republican virtue, on the notion that freedom is something we build together through active participation. Later, Rousseau's ideas would echo through American democratic theory, especially in the idea that legitimate government requires the consent of the governed. This was not just Locke's social contract, it was Rousseau's moral one. A vision of democracy that demanded not just laws, but character. Not just liberty, but responsibility. Importantly, Rousseau's vision was not the same as Locke's. Where Locke focused on the rights of the individual, Rousseau spoke of the power of the collective. One guarded freedom through boundaries. The other nurtured it through belonging. Both visions would shape the American experiment, but in different tones, in different registers, like two instruments playing the same revolutionary song. And soon, those notes would come alive, not in books, but in people. Because these ideas didn't stay bound to paper. They found voice in revolutionaries, in patriots, in citizens who turned Enlightenment into action. By the time the first cannonball flew across the American sky, the real revolution had already begun. Quietly, invisibly, in the minds of men who had studied ideas with the same devotion others reserved for the sword. Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Adams. These were not simply founders in the political sense. They were students of philosophy, deeply shaped by the writings of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Their libraries were filled with Enlightenment texts. Their speeches echoed with the language of reason and natural rights. They weren't just trying to escape a king. They were trying to build a republic rooted in principles no throne could touch. Look at the Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted by George Mason in 1776. It wasn't just a list of grievances. It was a philosophical statement, a declaration that all men are born equally free and independent, with inherent rights. It set the stage for the Bill of Rights, and it bore the fingerprints of Enlightenment thought throughout. Or take Thomas Paine's Common Sense, a pamphlet that would ignite a fire in the hearts of everyday colonists. Paine didn't appeal to heritage or divine right. He appealed to reason. He made philosophy feel personal, urgent, and accessible. And in doing so, he helped transform Enlightenment ideals into a mass movement. This was a different kind of war, one that wasn't just about land or taxes, but about how power should work and who gets to decide. The colonies weren't just rebelling, they were reimagining, trying for perhaps the first time in modern history to found a government not on tradition or bloodline, but on thought, on design, on the idea that truth could be reasoned and that reason could rule. And none of this would have been possible without the spread of ideas. Through salons, newspapers, and pamphlets, the Enlightenment spilled out of elite circles and into the streets. It became something that bakers, blacksmiths, and farmers could talk about by firelight. Philosophy, once the domain of scholars, became the seedbed of revolution. And as the gunpowder flared and the colonies declared their independence, these ideals did not fade. They only evolved. They grew into the scaffolding of something far more permanent, a constitution. The Declaration of Independence was a thunderclap, a bold proclamation that a new world was possible. But declarations, by nature, are beginnings. What came next was even more difficult, translating the poetry of revolution into the prose of governance. And here, once again, the Enlightenment guided the way. The years between 1776 and 1787 were filled with uncertainty. The war had been won, but the question of how to govern lingered like smoke. The Articles of Confederation had proven too weak, too loose to hold 13 independent states together under a single vision. The need for something stronger, yet still free, brought the founders back to the core principles they had always held: liberty, balance, consent. Enter the Constitution, a document not only of laws, but of ideas. Its structure echoed Montesquieu's division of powers, and its spirit pulsed with Locke's belief in natural rights. But to truly understand its philosophical depth, we must turn to the Federalist Papers, a series of essays written to defend and explain the new Constitution to a skeptical public. In Federalist No. 10, James Madison confronted one of democracy's deepest tensions. How do you protect minority rights in a system that runs on majority rule? His answer? A large republic, filled with many factions, where power would be dispersed and no single group could dominate. It was a masterclass in Enlightenment reasoning, balancing freedom with stability, passion with principle. In Federalist number 51, Madison took this further. "If men were angels," he wrote, "no government would be necessary. But since they are not, we must design institutions that control power, both over the people and within itself." This was the Enlightenment made real, a system where ambition checks ambition, and no one rules unchecked. Still, not everyone agreed. Anti-Federalists feared the new Constitution gave too much power to the central government. They wanted stronger protections for individual liberties. This tension between order and freedom led to the Bill of Rights, a set of 10 amendments that enshrined core Enlightenment values: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection from arbitrary arrest, the right to a fair trial. The Constitution, then, was not just a legal framework. It was a philosophical compromise, a delicate balance between competing visions of enlightenment. And yet, its creation raised a larger question still lingering in the minds of many thinkers across the world. Was America the exception, or simply the first? The American Revolution didn't erupt in isolation. It was part of something much larger, an intellectual current sweeping across the Atlantic. The Enlightenment wasn't confined to one continent or one language. It was a shared awakening, a continental shift in how humanity understood power, reason, and the purpose of government. From London to Paris, Edinburgh to Geneva, thinkers were wrestling with the same questions that gripped Jefferson and Madison. What is justice? Who should rule? Can freedom and order coexist? So when the colonies broke from Britain, the ripple was felt in every corner of Europe. And to many watching from abroad, America became more than just a new nation. It became a symbol, a living laboratory for Enlightenment ideals. Voltaire, ever the skeptic, admired the American rebellion for its audacity and its clear rejection of tyranny. Diderot called it the triumph of reason over tradition. Philosophers and radicals alike saw in the United States a blueprint, however flawed, for a new kind of world. But the path wasn't the same everywhere. Just a few years later, France would erupt in its own revolution, one inspired by similar ideals, but destined for a bloodier end. While America's Enlightenment birthed a constitution, France's would descend into the reign of terror, a stark reminder that ideas, once unleashed, do not always follow the path of their authors. Still, the American experiment cast a long shadow. It offered a kind of proof, however imperfect, that a government built on reason, on rights, and on consent could exist. But it also invited questions, because not all were free in this new republic, not all were heard, and not all were protected. So, before we celebrate too quickly, we must look more closely. Enlightenment ideals were powerful, but they weren't perfect, and their limitations tell a story of their own. For all its brilliance, the Enlightenment carried shadows. It spoke of liberty, but it practiced exclusion. It preached universality, yet often delivered only partial freedom. And that tension, the gap between its ideals and its realities, still echoes through history. The American Revolution was born of Enlightenment thought, but its promises were not extended to all. The same document that declared all men are created equal was signed by men who owned other human beings. Liberty, in practice, became something selective, granted to white male landowners, withheld from women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. This wasn't lost on everyone. Abigail Adams, writing to her husband John in 1776, famously urged him to remember the ladies as he helped draft the new laws. Her voice, though softened by affection, carried a truth that cut deep, that a revolution blind to half its people could not call itself whole. Years later, Frederick Douglass would call out the same contradiction more sharply. He asked how a nation founded on liberty could tolerate slavery, how the 4th of July could be celebrated by some while it marked bondage for others. His voice, clear and uncompromising, exposed the unfinished business of the Enlightenment. The truth is, the Enlightenment was visionary, but incomplete. It gave us the language of freedom, but not always the courage to apply it fully. Still, it laid a foundation, a framework that future generations could build on, argue with, expand. Because progress, like philosophy, is rarely perfect from the start. It unfolds, it deepens, it demands correction. And in that sense, the Enlightenment didn't fail. It simply began something much larger than itself. And yet, despite its contradictions and complications, the dream endured. The idea that reason, rights, and self-governance could guide a society did not die. It lives on, still evolving, still asking us to rise and meet its call. The American Revolution was never just a political upheaval. It was a revolution of the mind. A bold, audacious attempt to pull philosophy out of the pages of dusty books and breathe it into the fabric of a living nation. It wasn't merely about breaking ties with Britain. It was about breaking from the old world's assumptions of who holds power and why. The founding documents, so often treated as historical relics, are, in truth, living philosophies. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just a protest. It was a metaphysical statement about human worth. The Constitution wasn't just a structure. It was a reflection of centuries of thought on justice, balance, and governance. These texts don't just govern. They teach. They ask questions. They challenge us to think, to argue, to remember what freedom actually means. And yes, revolutions are loud. They shake cities. They raise flags. They leave scars. But the most enduring revolutions, the ones that last, aren't carried by bullets. They're carried by ideas. It is the ideas that outlive the battles, that persist long after the smoke clears, that whisper across time into new generations with new questions and new hopes. The Enlightenment did not end in 1776. It wasn't sealed in parchment. It lives on, in classrooms, in courts, in conversations between people who still believe that truth can be reasoned, that power can be checked, and that liberty, though imperfect, is always worth pursuing. And in that sense, the revolution never ended.